And I'm delighted to welcome some people here this morning who are going to share with us. Chris and Katie, who are a father and daughter, and they are going to share with us today on a topic that maybe tends to only be discussed in confidential environments usually. However, these two have chosen to step outside such safe places, but nevertheless trusting that this environment is a safe place, a church community. They're going to share their story of having their lives turned upside down, their family turned upside down by addiction and alcoholism. They're doing this because they feel that God has called them to share this story to help others. As Chris and Katie have learned, these issues, addiction, alcoholism, affect families of all levels of New Zealand society, including Christian families. But because of the shame and stigma attached to them, they're often hidden away and misunderstood. So this morning, Katie and Chris want to shine a light on these issues and share something of what they've learned on their road to recovery and of God's integral place in it. So, Chris and Katie, I invite you up. We're looking forward to what you have to share with us this morning, and thank you for coming and being willing to share with us today.
Thanks, Mike, for that warm welcome. It's a privilege to be here in church with you this morning. Actually, I feel quite comfortable here because I was brought up in the Baptist church. My dad, Roy Gaskell, was a Baptist minister in the 60s and 70s, leading Greyland Baptist, and then becoming the Baptist City Missioner. Working with alcoholics and addicts was a ministry that Dad was passionate about. And now, some 50 years later, our family's come full circle in a way that only a loving God could orchestrate. So we're here with you today. And on this rainy old morning that the Lord has made, I just want to ask you to close your eyes for a second and imagine you're standing on your favourite beach. Can you see the sun sparkling off the water? Can you feel its warmth on your back? Or maybe you're one of those people who's made that barefoot dash across the sand and are now cooling off in the shallows. We live on the North Shore, so when I close my eyes, I'm back on one of those beautiful little secluded bays on the coastal walk between Milford and Takapuna Beach. But unfortunately, there's no warmth from the sun. My wife Di and I are there in the pitch black of the midnight hour, and a cold wind is whipping the waves into whitecaps. It's full tide, and the waves are crashing against the rocks we're standing on. Di and I hug each other to stay warm. But this isn't a romantic moment because we're not alone. On either side of us there are police officers who have just spent the past couple of hours fruitlessly searching for our missing daughter. In a drunken blackout and off her head angry after physically fighting with a friend who had taken her car keys off her, Katie had last been seen running towards the water. And this was the police's last resort. As we stared helplessly out into the waves, we heard the distinctive roar of the police helicopter with its searchlight waving across the water. It worked its way up and down the beach over and over again before turning and heading back to base. The police officer in charge looked at us and said, "I'm sorry, there's nothing more we can do until morning." It was a shattering moment as the realisation set in that everything was pointing to our daughter having taken her own life. We went back to the cars and prepared to drive home. I took Katie's car, and the fear that we might have lost her was overwhelming. Then another thought popped into my head. And this truly was one of the lowest points of my life. For one terrible instant, I had a sense of relief. Relief that our nightmare of trying to cope with an out-of-control daughter would be over. You know, it's taken me many years to share that thought with Katie. And even now it shames me to the core to say those words out loud. But strange as it may seem, Katie has a completely different memory of that night.
Spoiler alert, the fact that I'm standing here now is a clue that I didn't go into the water that night. Instead, after fighting with my friend, I had passed out under a bush in someone's garden, and I only came to when I heard the police calling my name. Clearly, the sensible thing to do was to get away. So I started running. I ran through backyards of neighbouring properties, I climbed over fences, and I even hid under an upturned boat when I saw the police searchlight looking for me. In my mind, it was all just a bit of an adventure, and a clear example of how other people completely overreact just because I'm having a little bit of fun. Once everything had died down, I walked back to the main street of Takapuna, and I'm not too sure who was more shocked between Dad and I when he pulled up in my car a few minutes later. I told him how awesome I was, how stupid the cops were for not being able to find me, and instead of being impressed, he cried. You know, I'd love to be able to stand here and say that that was my rock bottom moment when I finally admitted just how sick I was. But in actual fact, I kept digging for nearly 2 more years before I finally, very reluctantly, got some help.
So how did it get to this? Well, sometime around her early teens, our happy, loving, empathetic little girl had started to become someone quite different. What began as moodiness or the occasional out-of-character incident descended into anxiety and isolation, depression and eating issues, which eventually spiralled out of control. Back then, we were a family in turmoil, and our life became a succession of dramas, broken promises, and overwhelming fear about what Katie's future held. And as a result, our once normal family life became a shambles as the close relationship we'd had with our youngest daughter was all but destroyed.
So hi, if you haven't figured out, my name's Katie and I'm an alcoholic and a drug addict. And today I have been clean and sober and in recovery for 9 years, 4 months and 3 days. Look, I don't know about you, but when I picture an addict, what I see is a guy living under a bridge with a bottle of whiskey and a brown paper bag, or a skinhead, wide-eyed with a needle hanging out of his arm. While those are both true representations of an addict, throughout my recovery journey, I've met addicts in many forms, from doctors and lawyers to gang members and criminals and everything in between. In recovery, we define an addict as a man or woman whose life is controlled by drugs, and at 19 years of age, I already fit that description perfectly. You see, I started drinking alcohol at the age of 13, and right from the start, I just didn't have an off button. Every time I drank, there was no amount of alcohol to satisfy me. This meant that I would drink until I either passed out or went into a blackout. And that's a state in which I can function at some level, but I have no idea of what I'm doing or what is happening to me. I have countless embarrassing, dangerous stories from this time period, but I was a binge drinker, right? Not an alcoholic. I thought alcoholics drank every day, and I only drank on weekends. What I didn't realize then was that I had no power over alcohol. I couldn't say no, I couldn't have just a few, and if I'm really honest with myself, my obsession with alcohol continued throughout the whole week. Even if I wasn't drinking, I was still thinking about it. They say addicts have a hole in the soul. For me, that felt like never truly fitting in, never being enough. Not pretty enough, not smart enough, not skinny enough, not funny enough. I felt empty. I had these voices in my head that would only get quiet when I was drinking, but true bliss was still always one drink away. It wasn't until I was 16 when I started using drugs, and quite honestly, I thought I'd found the solution to life. They call being on drugs being high, right? Well, I didn't feel high. I just felt normal. Because the pain that I felt inside would go away, the voices in my head would quieten down, and I actually felt okay. This meant that I progressed pretty quickly from using drugs on the weekend to everyday use to selling drugs, and as my peer group progressively went downhill, my world began to change.
You know, when we look back on this now, Di and I wonder how we can have missed the signs. I think one of the reasons was that in many ways, Katie wasn't doing anything that lots of other young people weren't doing at some level. But what we didn't realise at first was just how abnormal our daughter's relationship with substances was. You know, we went through a time when there seemed to be a never-ending stream of frightening incidents in which Katie put herself in dangerous situations. These incidents often involved police call-outs, including another occasion when the services of the police helicopter were required. And saying that here in this environment today might sound matter of fact, but I can assure you it was anything but. It's a frightening mix of fear, shame, anger and loss. As a parent, it's just terrifying to know your child is putting herself in jeopardy and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. In our ignorance, we'd been focused on trying to change her behaviour with all the tools us parents have at our disposal, including, I'm ashamed to admit, physical violence on one or two nightmare occasions. But none of them worked because we just didn't understand that Katie had a disease which human willpower is powerless against. A memorable and very permanent reminder of that time is a tattoo that I've got right here that says, "Kia kaha, be strong." Katie's got one the same. They were the result of a well-intentioned but futile attempt to bond together to fight the demon that was destroying our lives. As she had many times before, Katie promised with all her heart that she'd give up drugs and alcohol. As her dad, I promised her that I'd be there for her no matter what, and we went through the pain and tears of getting tattooed together to seal our commitment. We both saw this as a special moment in our father-daughter relationship. That night, I went to bed early, and soon after, Katie came down to the kitchen to ask Di to rub some ointment on her new tattoo. As she did so, Di looked into her eyes and saw that she was already wasted on drugs. Katie's heartfelt promises had lasted less than 6 hours before her mental obsession, combined with the physical craving for drugs, resulted in her picking up again. As parents, we'd now got to the stage where Di and I truly felt it was only a matter of time before we lost our beautiful girl. Pretty much whenever Katie went out, we would go to bed steeling ourselves that fateful knock on the door. And inevitably, it finally happened in the early hours one morning.
Full disclosure, this was a blackout night for me, so my recollection is pretty hazy. But after a fun night out, I can remember being outside of a club in Takapuna, and I assaulted a police officer. I remember being handcuffed, and then I spied a friend across the car park. He came to my rescue and somehow convinced the police officers to let me go on the promise that he would be taking me straight home. I can remember standing next to his car, and then I remember running. I ended up in a taxi and I gave the driver an address. At some point the driver asked if we were going to my house, and we absolutely were not. He was driving me to a cliff that I had planned to jump off. My next memory was of the taxi lighting up red and blue. And I'm sure you can all guess where this story is going, but the officer that I had assaulted earlier was the officer who had just pulled up in the police car. The next thing I recall, I was at my own house sitting in the back of the police car. I was absolutely feral, yelling and screaming at everybody, and because of that, the police officers decided that they should instead take me to the police station. When I got there, I was just as out of control, so for my own safety, they took me out of my clothes and put me into a safety jacket, which is basically a thick, strong pillowcase with armholes. And I went absolutely crazy. I was so crazy that at 45 kgs, I managed to rip the suit in half. Which according to the police is pretty impressive, although they were absolutely not impressed. I spent most of the night screaming and yelling. At some point I fell asleep, and when morning rolled round, I was woken up by the mental health team trying to talk to me. Naturally, I thought absolutely not, and I refused to talk to them. A little while later, they came around again, and this time I had enough clarity to realise that talking to them was going to be my only way out. So by that stage, I had had enough experience with the mental health team to know exactly how to spin a crappy story and get myself released. In hindsight, the worst part of this story for me, just as it is for the helicopter incident and many other of my tragic stories, is that at the time I just felt absolutely no remorse whatsoever. I had no concern at all for the people I had hurt while they were just trying to help me. Instead, I was just angry. I remember thinking how unfair it all was and what an overreaction everyone was having. Back then, I truly had no concept that my actions had consequences, not only for myself, but for the people around me.
The most amazing outcome from this night was that the policewoman who Katie had assaulted didn't charge her, but she instead made the life-changing decision to refer her to mental health services. I say life-changing because along with giving Katie another chance that up until then she certainly didn't deserve, the incident was also the catalyst for us, for her mum Di and I, to reach outside ourselves and seek more help. I know this will sound crazy given the sort of incident we've just shared with you, but at that stage we still didn't really know what Katie's problem was. All we knew was that things had to change before the next knock on the door brought us even worse news. We tried to get Katie into government-funded treatment, but were told that couldn't happen until she'd kicked her addiction. That wasn't very helpful, but for us it finally put a name to what we were dealing with. In the weeks following this incident, Katie reluctantly agreed to go into rehab. She was admitted to Capri Hospital on June 27th, 2013, and to say that her life, not to mention our family's life, has been transformed in the time since, is putting it mildly.
After that incident with the policewoman, I stopped hiding my drug use in front of my parents. I think on some level it was just a cry for help. I knew that I was in a very dangerous position. My life had spiraled out of control and I couldn't do anything within my power to stop it. At this point, I was on the brink of anorexia, as food was the only area in my life where willpower still seemed to work. I was using drugs every day, and although I hated drinking and was fearful of those blackouts, when alcohol was presented to me, I was powerless to say no. I was also powerless to keep my promises, like the one with the tattoo and many, many others. Even though deep down inside, I truly meant what I was saying when I made them. So I went into rehab because I wanted to get my life back together. But that didn't mean I had any intention of ever stopping drinking or using drugs. I simply wanted to learn how to use them better. I wanted to be smarter and I wanted to control my use, just like everybody else seemed to be able to do. I soon learned that that was never going to happen for me. One of the most powerful things that's ever been said to me was on my first day in rehab. One of the counsellors, a recovering meth addict himself, said to me, people in our position have three options: jails, institution, and death. He then looked me up and down, said my money's on death, and walked away. It was a wake-up call for me. It showed me the seriousness of my disease, but I still didn't surrender to the first step of the AA 12-step program, which is accepting that I'm powerless over my addiction and that my life had become unmanageable.
By the time Katie went into rehab, Di and I were just about as sick as she was. Sick from worry about her, but also sick in the way we were living. Excuse me. Embarrassed about what we saw as Katie's behaviour and our failure to control it as a good family should. We'd gradually isolated ourselves from our friends and family. Fortunately, just as it was for Katie, rehab was a turning point for Di and I too. It's where we finally began to understand that alcoholism or addiction is not bad behaviour or a lack of morals or willpower. It's a disease and is recognised as such by the World Health Organisation. And what that meant was that we didn't have a bad daughter that somehow we had to make good. We had a sick daughter that we needed to help get well. And just knowing that changed everything. Something else remarkable happened when Katie entered rehab too. On her first weekend there, a doctor, himself a recovering alcoholic, invited Katie and her roommate to church with the added lure of coffee and Dunkin' Donuts just up the road here straight afterwards. That's not the done thing in secular hospitals. In fact, it's against the rules. But Katie went along and rang us afterwards to tell us how good it was. Don and I were so shocked, we thought she must have been back on drugs. But even though at that stage we hadn't been to church for more than 20 years, we were so desperate to do anything that could help our daughter, we went with her the following weekend. The minute we stepped into that church, that Sunday morning, we knew we'd come home. And our journey back to him began.
So you'd be forgiven for thinking, oh cool, she went to rehab, found God, and boom, she was fixed. But the reality couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, at about 27 days clean, after a fight with my parents, I found myself again in the back of a police car being escorted to hospital. At this point, the insanity I'd faced while drinking was my everyday reality, and I began to think that suicide was an easy way out. The problem is, alcohol comes in bottles, but alcoholism lives in me. Recovery is by no means an easy, linear journey. In all honesty, I've struggled multiple times through my recovery, but I've always found myself having a one set of footprints in the sand moment where he carries me. Actually, I think you'd be surprised by who he has chosen to carry me. In my early recovery, my nana confessed to her gardener that her youngest granddaughter was struggling with addiction. To her surprise, he too was an alcoholic with over 20 years in recovery. He ended up taking me to meetings, helping me to feel a part of, and coached me through some of my early challenges. Another was the man who sold my parents their house. Turns out we had actually met him a year before in treatment, and since then he too had continued the life of recovery. Today he's not only a treasured friend to both Dad and I, but his journey through relapse and recovery has helped me to learn from his experiences. There's also a man who, after a string of drug-fueled robberies, spent his late 20s in jail. Well, he's now over 30 years clean and sober and drives me to rehabs all around Auckland to share the gift of recovery with those who still suffer from this disease. He also is going to be marrying me in about 6 months' time, which is pretty exciting. Let me just be clear, I mean marrying like he's going to be the officiant. I'm not marrying someone who is like
sorry,
quite
Alex.
far past, yeah.
That was a bit of a shock to Katie's fiancé.
Poor choice of words there.
Yeah.
Look, the cool thing about the fellowship of AA and NA is that everyone has a common purpose to help each other stay clean and sober one day at a time. And together we're continuing to learn how to live life on life's terms, and we've learned the hard way that recovery is an action program. We are forever reminded that God can move mountains, but you have to bring your shovel.
6 months after going into recovery, Katie accepted God into her life and was baptised. Soon after that, she went back to university and eventually completed her degree in early childhood education. That's a field she probably never would have been able to work in if she'd been arrested and charged with assaulting the policewoman that fateful night. Now 29, our daughter has grown into a beautiful young woman who's a productive member of society with a responsible job as a head teacher in an early childhood centre and a strong commitment to sharing her story of hope to help other young people entering recovery. And her journey has had a profound impact on her family in a much larger sense. Although we couldn't see it at the time, with hindsight we can look back and see God was holding us in his hands the whole time. countless times in her drinking and using days, Katie put herself in harm's way. But in every situation, God's protection was over her. He also put 3 special people into our life at a time when we needed them most. The first, of course, was that policewoman who made the life-changing decision not to charge Katie after the assault. The second was that counsellor at rehab who, as only one addict can say to another, spoke the terrible truth into Katie's life about what her future held. And the third was that alcoholic doctor at rehab who God used as his messenger to bring us back to him. Today, 3,412 long days after Katie first went into rehab, our family stands before you overwhelmingly grateful for the miracle of recovery we've been given. These days I even treasure that pointless tattoo we got all those years ago as a symbol of how far we've come. Make no mistake, we wouldn't wish the disease of addiction on anyone. But the Bible says God turns all things for good. And that's just what he's done for our family. Katie's addiction has brought us back to Jesus and also given us new purpose in our lives. We're no experts in this field by any means, but we've been through the fire and believe it's God's plan for Katie and I to use our experiences to help educate and encourage other sufferers and their families about the life-changing impact of recovery.
As I've said, I'm Katie and I'm an alcoholic and a drug addict. But these days, my disease doesn't define me. I'm now a functioning member of society, and thanks to recovery, I'm now living a life which I never dreamed possible for myself. Now, I'm not saying that I'm cured. In fact, I know that I never will be. Addiction and alcoholism are lifelong diseases. However, when I entered recovery, I was offered a solution, a daily reprieve which I received from attending regular AA and NA meetings, having a faith in God, and giving service not only to other recovering addicts, but also in my community. My goal in my drinking and using days was to feel numb, and standing here now, that's the last thing I'd ever want to feel. From the glimmer of hope that I received when I entered recovery to where I am now, I now have new light in my life. I have hope, I have love, laughter, and joy. But most of all, just for today, I have freedom from my addiction. Now, some of you may be sitting here questioning your own relationship with drugs or alcohol and thinking, well, at least I've never done that. My challenge to you would be yet. You haven't had the police helicopter searching for you yet. You haven't been hospitalized yet. You haven't ruined your relationships yet. Here's a question. If you were cooking and you set a pan on fire, would you immediately jump to action to douse the flames and minimize any potential damage? Or would you sit and wait, watching the fire destroy every corner of your house before you decided to take action? Now, we don't have any easy answers or quick fixes, but if you're struggling with issues of alcoholism or addiction in your family relationship, we want to offer you the precious God-given gift of hope that transformed the relationships in our prodigal family.
In closing, we just want to say that while alcohol and drugs are what people usually think of when they hear the word addiction, it actually takes many forms. Eating or not eating, porn, gambling, sex, you name it. And just because we're sitting here in church doesn't mean we're immune from them. So if there's anything in what Katie and I have shared that strikes a chord with you, or maybe someone you know and love, please feel free to talk with us. It would be our privilege to share the gift of recovery with anyone who needs it. Our family had no hope for the future when Katie was lost in the depths of her addiction. But now we can stand in front of you and honestly tell you that no matter what you or your loved ones have done, no matter what harsh words have been said, what lies have been told, what hurt has been inflicted, what secrets have been kept, God's never-ending grace means there's always a way back to the life that God intended for us. Can we just pray together? Thank you, Lord, for the privilege of sharing our testimony with these good people today. The words have been ours, Lord, but the glory is all yours. Thank you for the miracle you've blessed our family with. And we pray that your never-ending grace and mercy would extend to the still suffering addicts. Thousands of addicts meet daily in New Zealand and around the world. And when they get together, whether they're Christian or not, they pray these lovely words. God,
grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.
Amen.